Everything's gonna be all right. You just need to rest.
Thank you for being here.
I never heard the screech of tires on the gravel driveway or a frantic knock on my heavy oak door, just the sickening, wet thud of a human body hitting a decade's worth of dead leaves, a sound so final it felt like the ancient forest itself had finally dropped whatever heavy secret it was carrying. One wide, panicked sweep of my mag light beam across the property line, and there she was, illuminated in the stark white circle like a fallen angel in a stage play. Ivy Hall. The same girl who, in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, used to swap me her coveted strawberry gummies for the perfect, unshakable shoelace knots I could tie. Out cold, a dark, viscous stream of blood matting the hair at her temple, and impossibly, still wearing the faded, woven daisy chain bracelet I had braided for her on her front porch swing the long, humid summer we both turned 12. An entire decade of absolute, roaring silence between us, and then she lands at the very edge of my land like a long-lost letter the postman had forgotten to deliver for years, its contents now urgent and terrifying. I had meticulously built a quiet, isolated life for myself, a fortress of solitude I thought surprises couldn't possibly crawl through. But it turns out the past doesn't give a damn about meticulously constructed fences or locked gates, it just waits with infinite patience for the darkest, most moonless night to come crashing down at your feet. My heavy wrench clattered onto the concrete floor of the garage, leaving a greasy echo in the sudden, profound silence. The oil from the ATV I'd been tuning striped my hands like crude war paint as I crashed through the doorway and sprinted towards her. My mind was a frantic checklist of wilderness first aid. Pulse. Airway. Breathing. I knelt in the damp earth, my fingers, clumsy and shaking, pressing against the fragile skin of her neck. A pulse, yes, but it was a hummingbird's flutter, thin and terrifyingly erratic. Hypothermia was setting in, the night air was biting, and her jacket was hopelessly inadequate. A spinal injury was a definite possibility. The rule is simple, don't move her more than you absolutely have to. I shrugged off my own thick, fleece-lined flannel, the familiar scent of wood smoke and motor oil enveloping her as I wrapped it tight around her torso. I ran, my boots sinking into the soft ground, back toward the garage for the collapsible stretcher I keep propped against the wall for deer season accidents and the occasional careless hiker. Every single, pounding footstep seemed to dredge up a memory I'd buried so deep I'd pretended the graves were empty. There was Ivy, age 9, milk shooting out her nose in the school cafeteria because I'd told a stupid joke. Ivy, age 11, lying on the hood of my mom's beat-up Buick, pointing out fake constellations we'd named after our teachers. I had kept those pictures, those moments, locked down in the deepest vault of my mind for 10 years, now the vault door had been blown off its hinges, and they were stampeding over me, sharp-hoofed and relentless. Back inside the cabin, the warmth was a physical presence. I carefully laid her on the oversized couch near the hearth, my movements slow and deliberate, terrified of causing more damage. I threw 3 more logs onto the embers in the fireplace, coaxing the flames back to life, their orange glow dancing across her pale, still face. I filled a kettle and set it on the stove to boil, a primal, movie-logic instinct to make things better with hot water. A quick check of my phone confirmed my isolation, 0 bars. The nearest cell tower was miles away, across treacherous terrain. Calling for help was not an option tonight. With a resigned sigh, I retrieved my heavy-duty first aid kit, the one I'd built myself. I cleaned the gash on her temple with antiseptic wipes, my touch as gentle as I could manage. Her skin was so cold. Using the sterile kit, I applied 3 butterfly stitches, the adhesive strips pulling the wound's edges together into a neat, closed line. She didn't flinch, didn't even stir. For the next hour, I did nothing but sit in the armchair opposite her, watching the slow, shallow rise and fall of her chest, repeatedly checking her pulse, partly for medical reasons, but mostly as a desperate, tactile proof that this wasn't some brake-fume hallucination brought on by too many hours in the garage. She was real. She was here. We were 13, completely and utterly soaked from a freak summer thunderstorm that had ambushed us halfway through our grand project, building a raft behind her grandma's dilapidated barn. The sky, a placid blue just an hour before, had turned a bruised purple gray. The first crack of lightning sent the squirrels chattering in panic, and the rickety pallets we'd scavenged for our vessel collapsed into a useless heap of splintered wood. We bolted, laughing hysterically, for the dry sanctuary of the hayloft. Rain hammered the tin roof with the force of thrown gravel, a deafening, rhythmic drumming that seemed to shake the whole structure. In the sudden, electric dimness of the loft, surrounded by the sweet, dusty smell of alfalfa, she'd turned to me, her eyes wide and serious in a way that 13-year-old eyes rarely are. She yelled to be heard over the storm, "I love you, you know." And I, the reigning genius of emotional deflection, had yelled back with a nervous grin, "Duh, I love me too." She shoved me, hard, into a mound of soft alfalfa, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs in a gasp. Before I could retaliate, she was smearing a muddy handprint on my cheek, her laughter echoing in the small space. She solemnly declared us blood sisters, but without any of the ceremonial, messy bloodletting. It was a promise made in mud and rainwater, sealed by the thunder. Back then, the entire concept of enough felt pocket-sized, something you could hold in the palm of your hand. It was a shared bag of chips, a dry place in a storm, a friend who knew you loved her even when you were too stupid to say it right. The digital clock on the mantel read 7:14 a.m. when her eyelids began to flutter. The morning light was filtering through the dusty windows, painting stripes across the living room floor. I was slumped in the armchair, stiff and exhausted, a cold mug of coffee cradled in my hands. Her first word was my name, whispered so quietly it was almost lost in the crackle of the dying fire. Nora? My own name sounded alien, borrowed, like a piece of clothing I'd been leasing for a decade and had just been asked to return. She tried to push herself up, a pained grimace flashing across her face before I was at her side, gently easing her back down onto the pillows. "Easy there," I murmured. "Don't move. You took a nasty fall." Her eyes, the same deep green the first remembered, were clouded with a terrifying vacancy. They roamed the rustic ceiling of my cabin, the exposed beams and pine boards, as if searching for a map. What happened?" Her voice was raspy, laced with confusion. She stared at the ceiling for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. I think I was running," she finally said, her words slow and deliberate. "Running from something I can't remember." And then, just like that, she checked out again. She wasn't unconscious, not this time. Her eyes were open, but she was simply gone. It was a conscious, deliberate retreat into some fortified space deep inside herself, a place where my questions couldn't reach. She was done. I let her rest, pulling the heavy quilt up to her chin. In the kitchen, I poured myself another coffee, this one brewed so strong and black it felt as thick as the guilt churning in my stomach. Standing at the kitchen window, I scanned the tree line where my small clearing gave way to the dense, unforgiving expanse of the national forest. Miles and miles of raw, untamed wilderness. You don't just stumble into this place by accident. You come here only if you are profoundly lost, or if you are desperate to be. The last I'd heard, a rumor passed through a mutual acquaintance years ago, was that Ivy was living in a trendy city apartment, illustrating charming children's books about a little hedgehog detective who solved moonlight mysteries. The admission was a bitter pill, but I had secretly ordered one online. It had arrived in a plain brown mailer, and I'd read it in a single sitting, my heart aching with a strange mixture of pride and devastating loneliness. I'd then slid it under my bed, hiding it between a spare fan belt and a box of old tax returns, like it was contraband. Now, the author herself was asleep under my grandma's antique quilt, her breathing shallow, her future a terrifying question mark. And I felt like a complete and utter fraud for every single minute of the last 10 years I'd spent pretending, even to myself, that I didn't miss her with every fiber of my being. We were 18. My dad was fresh in the ground, the scent of funeral lilies still clinging to all my mother's clothes. She was drowning in a sea of condolence cards and final notices, the weight of a mortgage she couldn't possibly pay on her own pressing down on her. In that toxic environment of grief and panic, I had convinced myself that leaving, running away, was the only way I would ever be able to breathe again. Ivy had a different plan, one woven from optimism and shared history. She wanted us to get a tiny, run-down apartment above the downtown laundromat, a place that always smelled of bleach and damp fabric. She'd argued, with all the fierce conviction of youth, that our love, our friendship, was strong enough to trump zip codes and financial hardship. I, in my armor of pragmatism and grief, had thrown her words back in her face. "Love doesn't keep the lights on, Ivy," I'd said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. We had stood on her parents' lawn, the sprinkler ticking back and forth, and cried until we couldn't breathe. We made all the usual promises to call every day, to write every week. But the daily calls quickly dwindled to weekly ones, then to sporadic texts, until finally, the texts became nothing but crushing, empty silence. 6 months after I left, my mom mentioned on a strained phone call that she'd heard Ivy was dating some guy named Reese from the new climbing gym. I remember hanging up and walking straight to my garage, burying myself in the greasy, logical world of torque specifications and overtime shifts. I figured hearts were just like carburetors. If you tuned them just right, they'd learn to run on pure, unadulterated anger if they had to. It was almost noon when she was finally awake enough to sit up on her own. I handed her a mug of coffee, and her hands shook so badly that the liquid sloshed over the rim. She spoke in broken, disjointed fragments. She'd been hiking the Bartram Trail, taking photos at the scenic overlook. And then, just a terrifying blackout. Nothing. "I can't do a hospital, Nora," she said, her voice firm, a sliver of the old, stubborn Ivy I knew. Her eyes pleaded with me. I opened my mouth to argue, to list all the very logical reasons she needed a doctor, concussion, internal bleeding, the works, but she cut me off before I could start. "Please. Just give me a day. 24 hours. Then I promise, I'll be gone." The way she said my name, not borrowed this time, but like it was a rope she was clinging to in a storm, made my ribs physically ache. The carefully constructed walls I'd built around my heart crumbled to dust in that single moment. One day, I found myself saying, the words feeling both like a promise and a capitulation. "You rest for one day. Then we figure out what comes next. Together." The last word hung in the air between us, heavy with 10 years of unsaid things. 2 winters back, someone had torched my detached storage shed, the one where I kept spare parts and old project cars. The volunteer fire department chief, a man I'd known my whole life, had ruled it an electrical fire, blaming my own bad wiring. It was a plausible explanation. I was always tinkering, always running extension cords. The insurance company paid out the claim without much fuss. And yet, a week later, sifting through the charred, stinking debris, I found it, a red 5-gallon gas can, sitting perfectly upright in the ashes, miraculously untouched by the blaze. It hadn't been mine. The message felt chillingly personal, a clear and violent statement: "You're not welcome here." I had tried to dismiss it, blaming it on random teenage vandals, a symptom of the world's growing decay. But now, watching Ivy flinch at every sudden pop and crackle from the fireplace, a much darker, more terrifying theory began to take root in my mind. What if the message hadn't been for me at all? What if it had been a warning intended for her, a threat sent years in advance? And what if I was just the collateral damage? I spent the afternoon fixing the broken ATV, the familiar work of my hands a comforting balm for my frayed nerves. I needed the noise, the grease, the logic of a machine to drown out the illogical chaos that was now sleeping on my couch. Mid-afternoon, while she was napping fitfully, I decided to change her bandage. I gently peeled back the butterfly stitches. A angry, purple crescent was blooming under her skin, the bruise dark and ugly. As I was applying a fresh dressing, her eyes snapped open and she caught my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Still keep secrets in your toolboxes," she whispered, her voice husky with sleep. A ghost of a smile played on her lips. I felt my own lips twitch in response. "Only the sharp ones," I murmured back. She tugged me down, just slightly, bringing my face closer to hers. "I missed your voice," she said, her gaze intense. It always sounded like gravel and honey. A blush, hot and unwelcome, crawled up my neck, a teenage reaction I thought I'd long outgrown. The shrill, piercing whistle of the kettle on the stove shattered the moment, and we both pulled back as if burned, saved by the bell. The gentle rain from the afternoon had thickened into a soupy, impenetrable fog by nightfall. While I had the quilt she'd been using in the washing machine, I saw them. Faint, but unmistakable. Fingerprint-shaped bruises encircling her upper arms, hidden beneath the sleeve of her jacket. My blood ran cold. Later, as we sat in near silence by the fire, she finally offered up another piece of the puzzle, her voice a barely audible whisper. I wasn't hiking alone. I waited, not pushing. Reese and I, things got heated. She wouldn't say more, just curled inward on the couch, making herself smaller, wrapping her arms around her knees. The bruises on her arms were a silent testament to whatever heated meant. I finished folding the warm, clean quilt and handed her one of my old, soft sweatshirts and a pair of sweatpants. You're safe here, I promised, the words feeling both powerful and wholly inadequate. She looked at me, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and then she simply broke. She cried, not loud, racking sobs, but quiet, defeated tears that dripped onto my jeans as she leaned her head against my knee. I just sat there, my hand resting awkwardly on her back, while the fire burned low and the rain against the window sounded, for a moment, almost like forgiveness. We were 16, camping out in her backyard, huddled in a two-person tent with 2 stolen beers we'd liberated from her dad's garage fridge. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and citronella, and the night was alive with the blinking, magical ballet of fireflies. She was tracing patterns on the tent wall, her face illuminated by our single flashlight. Ever think about kissing a girl? She asked, her voice casual, but her hand had stopped moving. I shrugged, trying to mimic her nonchalance, even as my heart started banging against my ribs like a trapped bird. I dunno. Maybe. She turned to face me, the space between us suddenly shrinking, charged with a strange new electricity. She leaned in, her eyes searching mine, her breath warm and smelling faintly of beer and bubblegum. Our noses were inches apart. I could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. Then, just as suddenly, she paused, a nervous laugh bubbling up and breaking the spell. Nah, weird, she'd said, pulling back and grabbing the bag of marshmallows instead. We threw them at each other until the bag was empty, the moment buried under a pile of sugar and feigned indifference. The next morning, we pretended with all our might that it had never happened. But that almost kiss became a secret, sacred artifact in the museum of my memory, something I would pull out and examine late at night whenever the world felt too loud and too straight. On the morning of the second day, she finally stood on her own 2 feet, shuffling around my kitchen in my baggy sweats, looking small and fragile. As I handed her a fresh mug of coffee, she spilled the rest of the story. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were reciting a story about someone else. Reese, it turned out, owed a great deal of money to some very serious, very unpleasant, collectors. They weren't loan sharks, they were something worse, more organized. They had tracked Ivy and Reese to the overlook, not for a scenic view, but for a confrontation. There was an argument. A shove. A sickening fall against the rocks. And then, the blackout. When Ivy came to, Reese was gone. She panicked and ran, scrambling through the dense underbrush, thorns tearing at her clothes, with no destination in mind, just a primal need to get away. She ran until the woods simply ran out, spitting her onto the edge of my property, my small, isolated clearing, the first sign of civilization she'd seen. I didn't come here for a rescue, Nora, she said, staring into her mug. I wasn't even thinking about you. I just ran out of forest. The stark, accidental nature of her arrival was somehow more painful than if she had sought me out on purpose. I never had a dramatic coming-out scene. There was no tearful confession, no big family meeting. One afternoon, about a year after I'd left home, my mom found me sitting on my childhood bed, crying over a faded photograph of Ivy and me from that summer with the raft. She just stood in the doorway for a long moment, then said, with her typical, quiet wisdom, "Hearts don't break like that over just friends, Nora." And that was that. It was never mentioned again. My dad died shortly after, and our grief became a thick fog that ate every other potential conversation. Later, in mechanics school, I was surrounded by men who cared more about compression ratios than who you slept with. My sexuality was a non-issue, a piece of data nobody ever asked for. I dated a few women here and there over the years, a bartender, a librarian, another mechanic. But every relationship was a ghost story, orbiting the same massive, unanswered what-if that was shaped exactly like Ivy Hall. That afternoon, we sat at my worn kitchen table and mapped out our options. Each one felt like a different path to failure. Option A, wait for them to find the road, which felt like sitting ducks. Option B, hike 12 miles through rough terrain to the ranger tower and call the cops, which felt slow and exposed. Option C, fortify the cabin and fight, which felt like a scene from a movie with a bad ending. None of them felt remotely survivable. I stared out the window at the old, forgotten Ford Bronco that had been sitting under a tarp for 5 years, my dad's last unfinished project. An idea, insane and reckless, began to form. Option D, I said, turning back to her. We fix the Bronco. Tonight. We slip south through the national forest's old logging backroads. By dawn, we're on a highway they won't be watching. We get to Atlanta, sell the Bronco for cash, and use that money to buy 2 one-way plane tickets to somewhere they'd never think to look. Oregon, maybe. She stared at me, her coffee forgotten, her eyes wide with disbelief. You'd torch your entire life? For me? The question hung in the quiet cabin. I looked at her, really looked at her, the bruise on her temple, the fear in her eyes, the ghost of the 13-year-old girl in the hayloft, and the answer was the easiest, most honest thing I'd said in a decade. I'd torch it for us, I heard myself say, the words feeling like they were mine and not mine, all at once. The next 2 days were a blur of focused, frantic preparation. It wasn't a montage, it was hard, greasy, exhausting work. I drained the old fluids from the Bronco, the oil coming out like black sludge. I changed the spark plugs, flushed the radiator, siphoned the old gas, and swapped the 2 best tires from my truck onto its rusted rims. I rewired the fog lights to work on a separate switch, imagining us navigating a dark, unmarked road. Ivy, surprisingly, became my apprentice. She cleaned the battery terminals, handed me tools, and packed a duffel bag with every can of beans, bag of rice, and bottle of water I owned. She found an old atlas and began meticulously sketching out our route on a paper napkin, a web of tiny backroads and county lines. At night, exhausted and covered in grime, we'd sit by the fire and test out new names, trying them on for size. Sam and Jade, she suggested. Riley and Quinn, I countered. We would dissolve into fits of laughter that made our ribs hurt, the sound echoing in the small cabin, chasing out the ghosts. We were building another raft, just like we had as kids, this one made of rust and desperation instead of rotting pallets. But we were building it together. And the building, I realized, was the whole point. Dawn on the 3rd day broke with a sky as clear and empty as my conscience felt. The air was cold and sharp. I left a simple note on the kitchen table, weighted down by a salt shaker, gone fishing. Back next month. It was a flimsy lie, but it was something. Ivy stood by the passenger door, clutching her little hedgehog book to her chest like it was a passport to a new world. I slid behind the wheel, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The engine coughed once, sputtered, whined, and then, with a roar, it caught. The whole vehicle shuddered to life. We rolled silently down the gravel driveway, lights off, and onto the dirt access road. As we passed the first ridge that would hide my cabin from view, I allowed myself to look back one last time. A thin curl of white smoke was rising from the chimney, the remnants of our last fire, looking for all the world like a single finger waving a slow, sad goodbye. A wave of loss, sharp and profound, washed over me. Then, Ivy's hand found mine in the space between the seats, her fingers lacing through mine. Her grip was firm, resolute. "Forward," she whispered. I squeezed her hand back, shifted the Bronco into drive, and pressed the gas. We live in a small, coastal town now, the kind of place where the worst crime reported in the local paper is a stolen bicycle. I fix boat engines at the marina, the scent of salt and diesel a constant companion. Ivy found a publisher for a new series of textbooks, beautifully illustrated guides to the creatures of the local tide pools. We settled on Alex and Alex because trying to remember who was supposed to be Riley and who was supposed to be Quinn always felt like too much work. Most nights, we walk along the old wooden pier, the wind whipping our hair, the sounds of the gulls and the waves a soothing lullaby. She started writing a new story in her spare time, a tale about a brave little hedgehog who repairs broken lighthouses so that lost ships can always find their way home. Sometimes, I still wake up in the dead of night, gasping for air, absolutely convinced that I can smell pine trees and wood smoke. But before the panic can take hold, she's there, pulling me close, her voice a warm anchor in the darkness. "We're here," she whispers into my hair. "We're safe. We're ours." The past doesn't ever really vanish. It doesn't get erased. It just learns, eventually, to knock first before it comes inside. Have you ever had someone from your past crash land back into your life after years of deafening silence? What would you have done in my place? Would you have pointed them toward the nearest highway, or would you have started packing the truck? Leave a comment below and tell me your story. If you want more stories about busted engines, desperate escape plans, and the lighthouses we build to guide each other home, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. I'll be here, wrench in hand, waiting to see what lands on my doorstep next.